Hello and welcome to the Optimizing Human Performance podcast, the show where we talk to world-leading experts about how to unlock the full potential of those who operate in high-stress, high-stakes environments. I'm Martin Jones.
And I'm Jonpaul Nevin. Today we're with the award-winning author and sports journalist Sam Peters, talking about concussion.
When someone's lost consciousness, there is no doubt that they have suffered a traumatic brain injury, but the majority of concussions don't involve the loss of consciousness.
Sam's work has transformed sports attitudes towards head injuries. He was the driving force behind the Mail on Sunday's Concussion in Rugby campaign and has recently published a critically acclaimed book on the topic called Concussed, Sport's Uncomfortable Truth.
People have been talking about the long-term effects of repetitive head trauma for a long time, but then that narrative changed around 2001, and it was largely in order to suit the narrative that the professional sports industry wanted to push out.
We talked to Sam about the role of emerging technologies in diagnosing concussion in both sport and military contexts, and about the potentially devastating impacts of asymptomatic sub-concussive events.
Hi Sam, welcome to the Optimizing Human Performance podcast. How are you doing today?
Yeah, really good. Thanks, Martin. Very well indeed. Thanks for having me on.
You're very welcome. What we like to do, start off by handing it straight over to you to talk about yourself. Can you give us your backstory? How did you get to where you are now, and what are you doing at the moment?
Well, 46 years old now, so I'm now running two businesses, one which is called Concussed Media and the other one is Planted Community. They're both essentially media and events companies. But really my backstory is I grew up loving sport. When my brother was 6 and I was 4, and we started hitting tackle bags from a pretty early age and just absolutely loving sport. Rugby, football, cricket, anything we could get our hands on, any ball that we could play with and anything we could watch on TV, that was our life really. And as I grew older, I turned out I was a half-decent player, captained the first 15 at school, first 11 at cricket, went on to Edinburgh University where I played for the first 15 up there, but also started getting injured playing rugby. I did a short service limited commission with the Royal Fusiliers. It was a brilliant year that I had with them, but I also played rugby for the regiment and started playing with the big boys, I guess. And I definitely recall picking up a few nasty shoulder injuries, which I probably shrugged off with a few pints in the mess afterwards, but got to university and that shoulder injury just kept getting worse through playing. And I ended up dislocating it probably 30 plus times, had 3 reconstructions. And at the age of 22, decided probably enough's enough for me on the rugby circuit. And unfortunately, my hope of going into the infantry took a bit of a backward seat there at that point as well. So had to kind of reappraise what my future would look like and decided I was going to try and become a sports writer. Got on a postgrad diploma at City, and before I knew it, I was out in the big wide world working for newspapers and covering sport for a living, and focused very much on professional rugby and cricket. And I guess from an early stage in rugby, I was really quite concerned about the injury profile of the sport. I'd obviously played it a lot and knew a lot about the game and what it took to take the field, but I was pretty convinced that after the game went professional in 95 that the injury profile was basically skyrocketing, and I saw a heck of a lot of concussions, heck of a lot of severe injuries which I didn't really recognise from my time playing, and started writing about it. And as a journalist, I saw it as my job to report on the story. I started looking at the data, and really, long story short, Martin, that led me to writing this book, Concussed, which has come out in the last year and landed incredibly well. You know, that's really what I'm here talking about today.
So Sam, I got eyes on Concussed earlier this year and it was a fascinating read. You allude to the fact that you observed through your work as a journalist this increased occurrence of injuries which are happening in rugby because of the professionalism. But what were those injuries and what was sort of driving it? Because obviously professionalism, money comes into the game, there's more at stake, shall we say.
Yeah.
So was that one of the mechanisms which were driving your observations?
Definitely. So, I mean, there were multiple factors at play here, Jonpaul, and a big driver for everyone was the fact that there was so much more at stake. So previously the guys had been training a couple of times a week and playing on a Saturday. Really, the rugby for a lot of guys was almost a sort of bit of a distraction from the real sport, which was in the bar afterwards. But, you know, as the game went professional, you were playing for your contract, short-term contracts a lot of the time, coaches and staff under a lot of pressure, doctors under a lot of pressure to get guys back on the field quicker. That pressure was coming from the players themselves a lot of the time and the coaches, you know, media scrutiny around results and jobs dependent on results. Winning became the be-all and end-all. And as the game got more professionalised very, very quickly, the guys were going from, as I say, training a couple of times a week to training 5 to 6 times a week, spending hours and hours in the gym. Sports science became a thing. Nutrition became a thing. You know, the guys got bigger, stronger, faster, really, really quickly. The sport became spoken about not just as a contact sport, but as a collision sport. And the defences got much more organised. The attacking play got more organised, but the commitment and the physicality went absolutely through the roof. And I should say also the laws were changed and tweaked constantly to make it a more attractive game for television audiences. The ball in play was longer as well, which again increased the frequency and volume of collisions. And it stood to reason for me that the more times bigger guys smashed against each other, there were going to be consequences. And you asked about some of the injuries, and I was speaking to surgeons, doctors who were saying that they were observing a change in the type of injuries, knees obliterated, biceps ripped off the bone, lots and lots of concussions, head injuries, brain injuries, and also the guys were going back onto the field so much faster, so much more frequently. So there are all sorts of challenges at stake. And I think there was also an element here which was around the difficulty in speaking up. If you were essentially calling out this practice from within a team structure, that was really, really difficult. And I observed quite early on that the Players' Union was struggling to challenge the authorities really and represent their members.
Obviously, rugby has quite a unique subculture, as do many sports, many organisations. What was the general attitude towards concussion? I can imagine, obviously, people taking a big hit. From a spectator standpoint, a lot of people would be, oh yeah, that's what I want to see. But surely as a player and surely as a coaching staff, there must have been some sort of negative approach to that or belief.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, what became apparent early on, and I think what the marketeers latched onto within professional rugby was that those massive collisions, the hit, as we call it now, was really quite attractive to people. People liked to watch those. The hits on social media, people just watch those immediate collisions, but it was coming at a price, and that was always my position. And as I spoke to the guys more, certainly around kind of 2011, 12, where I started to get seriously concerned about the frequency of concussions and the data that was coming out and the direction of travel for the sport, I started to speak to guys off the record a lot of the time. A lot of my mates had gone into the sport and played it professionally, so I was getting a kind of inside track a lot of the time. And it was really clear to me that there was this kind of dark humour around what they were going through. They kind of knew that it was extreme, but they didn't necessarily have anywhere else to put it. So they were just accepting it and a lot of the times laughing at it. Certainly I spoke to Lewis Moody, he's a good friend of mine, former England captain, who I'd observed in 2007 get knocked out twice in a World Cup game against Tonga in Paris and played on. So knocked unconscious, not just sort of like a bit wobbly or a bit shaky or completely unconscious. So boxer would have ended the fight right there. There was nothing in the protocols at that time to say that he should have been allowed to play on. He should have come off. But it become completely normal for him to play on. But I was very concerned about Lewis in that game, but again, probably struggled to articulate that in the paper. It wasn't deemed a story at that time. But Lewis told me, the guys would just get round at Leicester, which was notoriously brutal training environment, and essentially just laugh it off, laugh at how long it took someone to regain consciousness, laugh at how long it took them to get their balance back. Concussion was a joke, basically, and that was their way of managing.
Sam, you've talked about people being knocked out. They're on the floor, they're spark out, they look like they're asleep.
Yeah.
I remember as a university student many years ago now, watching Leeds Rhinos. I used to live quite close to that stadium.
Yeah.
And the number of people that I saw staggering, they weren't knocked out, but they've had their bell rung.
Yeah.
I think that was the phrase. You could see them staggering around. They've lost their balance, but they are conscious. So what are we talking about here? Is it when people are blackout, knocked out? Is that the problem, or is it more subtle than that?
It's much more subtle than that, Martin. And the reason I used that case is because it was so beyond reasonable doubt. So when someone's lost consciousness, there is no doubt that they have suffered a brain injury, traumatic brain injury. The issue is much more subtle than that. And there are far more ways that you can assess or diagnose a concussion through symptoms, loss of consciousness being just one, but the majority of concussions don't involve a loss of consciousness, but you can look at ataxia, as in loss of balance, fencing, pushing your arms out. You sometimes see where the arms just fly out involuntarily, nausea, sensitivity to light, mood swings. There's lots of symptoms that can come later or indeed at that point. But there's another issue at play which is becoming understood more and more now, which is exposure to what we call sub-concussive blows, which are essentially head trauma which doesn't present with symptoms, but over time, and this is conversations, in fact, I've been having earlier this morning with senior representatives and professional players, is how do we reduce this overall exposure? Because there's a longer term piece at play, and the thing that was kind of partly getting me so exercised around 2012, 2013 was the fact that there was a very significant legal case brewing in the NFL, American football, with former players being found to have something called chronic traumatic encephalopathy in their brains, and the association really between repetitive head trauma exposure and a degenerative disease called CTE.
We're going to talk about CTE in a minute, but before we do that, I want to maybe address a few myths around head injury.
Yeah.
I've listened to your book and I recommend it highly because there's some really interesting stories, quite sad stories.
Yeah.
But it's a fantastic read for anyone interested in this area.
Thank you.
So the pervasive myth, I think it's a myth, correct me if I'm wrong, that a concussion when you're knocked out is just like restarting a computer. The power's off and then it comes back on again and then you're good to go. Mm-hmm. I remember playing rugby at a younger age and hearing that from coaches. You know, it is literally like switching a computer on and off, rebooting the system.
Yeah.
Is that true?
No. And I was horrified to hear that being pushed out, that line from senior medics within sport, when I started drilling down on this and actually going and challenging some of the medical authorities. But there was let's say, a train of thought that was perpetuated largely within sport, actually, that was basically what happened, that the brain was kind of unique to any other system or organ in the body, where we all know, I've described at the beginning how my shoulder was, once I did it once early doors as a 19-year-old, it was never the same again and was essentially weakened from that point on. But there was a theory going around which wasn't based on any robust science whatsoever, that you could essentially be knocked unconscious and then just, as you say, reboot the computer and crack on and everything was normal and there were no problems. And that to me was one of the central issues for rugby, because that narrative suited everyone essentially, even though it wasn't true, it suited everyone to believe that there was no structural damage done to your brain when you stretched everything and bounced it all around and damaged your brain. So that was definitely one of the myths. I haven't heard that line for quite a long time, although I obviously write about it in the book, but I think that idea has been well and truly put on the rubbish tip where it belongs.
Sam, sort of expanding upon that then, is our acceptance of concussion, is it anything new? Or is it something which has sort of been recognised in the past? There's a term you use in your book, punch drunk.
Yes.
So people have sort of realised that if you get concussed, that there's going to potentially have not only short-term but also long-term ramifications.
Yeah, so absolutely. People have been talking about the long-term effects of repetitive head trauma for a long time. As far back as 1928, there was a neuropathologist in America called Harrison Martland who discovered what was termed then dementia pugilistica, punch-drunk syndrome, a pathology in boxers who were presenting with symptoms later in life that he robustly argued was linked to repetitive head trauma they'd suffered in the ring. And there's multiple other pieces of work, research, senior Harvard professors, doctors looking at this over an extended period of time, who were all arguing that multiple concussions were worthy of significant concern. And if you suffered a number of them, you should be basically looking for another sport to play. But then that narrative changed around 2000, 2001. And I identify the group of doctors that were the ones who drove that change in narrative. And I argue in the book it was essentially largely in order to suit the narrative that the professional sports industry wanted to push out.
Sam, I'm intrigued by some of the history. Are you aware of any data or any anecdotal reports from non-sport areas. I'm thinking the First World War, for example, where you're going to get a lot of young men who've got significant head trauma.
Yeah.
Not just in terms of actual structural damage, bits and pieces shot away, blown away, but just repeated head injuries.
Yeah.
When you were doing your research and you were looking at the book, did you find any information we should really know about from those conflicts, from other occupations where people are likely to get head injuries?
Not specifically from the First World War or Second World War, but that's partly because I haven't looked that closely, although it's an area I'm increasingly interested in, because that idea, deserters being shot and trench warfare, the psychological damage, but also the potentially physical blast damage that was happening to guys who weren't obviously injured, but may have suffered trauma to the head, to the brain, which was impossible to identify, and behaviours that occurred subsequent to that could have been related to actually having suffered a brain trauma. And it sort of still horrifies me to this day to think that guys could have been shot essentially for deserting or essentially acting in an inappropriate way where they may have actually been injured but no one realised. A lot of the research that has come out, especially from Boston University, has been in part linked to funding from the US military. It's clearly relevant to a military community, I would suggest, because blast injuries occur and concussions occur on the battlefield, obviously. And some of the work I've done previously was working with some wounded soldiers, part of a great group called the Road to Recovery. They were severely wounded, obviously loss of limbs in Afghan and Iraq. But I think elements around brain trauma and damage done on that front is a really interesting and important conversation that's going on in the military at the moment. It's probably one of the next bits of work I'm going to do is to actually look at that area, because I think it is so important and so relevant. And certainly the US and Canadian military are looking really closely at how the effects of blast damage can affect performance on the battlefield. And this was the piece I was really arguing a lot in rugby, because essentially in professional sport, player welfare is all well and good, but ultimately the thing that affects change is what's going to drive the performance of my team. The coaches are incredibly powerful directors of rugby, and it's clear, and there is lots of evidence here through research papers, and this has come from the RFU's own research, but independent research as well, lots and lots of research to show you shouldn't be keeping your players on the field who've got concussion if you want to win the game, because you want guys who are ready to respond immediately, their hand-eye coordination spot on, their decision-making capability is spot on. You don't want guys who are feeling fuzzy, who are unsure of their balance, their motor functions damaged. You want your guys to be on top of their game in every sense. And I think that's still a piece of work that needs to be done in rugby and the military, probably, in terms of spotting that. In order to maximise the performance of your team and your people, you need to make sure they haven't got brain damage.
So just linked to that then, if we're going to help people who work in areas where head injuries are possible, maybe even likely, what are the typical signs and symptoms of someone who's had a head injury? If we're saying that being sparked out is a sign, but it's not the only sign.
No.
How else can we help identify people who've suffered a head injury?
Sensitivity to light, hypersensitivity to noise can lead into mood swings, drowsiness. Those kind of things are warning signs if they can then be associated with the effects of a head trauma. There's now all sorts of tech which has come onto the market, which things like measuring how your eyes react, how you're responding to different senses, data from accelerometers in mouth guards. I think wrongly, World Rugby has chosen to actually look at G-forces and have literally a number, 70G, which is where they will take players off for assessment. I don't think we're even close to understanding that bit yet, but what is definitely happening is there's a huge move to generate data around head trauma, which I think in the future is going to be incredibly valuable in actually assessing and diagnosing concussion, and then subsequent to that, returning guys to the field of play, or in the military case, I guess, to the battlefield when they're actually fit and ready. And several physios and doctors have said to me previously, we can scan a hamstring after it's been torn. We know what a fully fit, recovered hamstring looks like after damage, but we don't know what a fully fit, recovered brain looks like. And I think that's that's the next piece of work. And when you think that the brain is the most important part of your body, pretty much bar none, it's where all your decisions come from and your actions are made, to think that we're sending guys back into that frame when they potentially could have significant damage is pretty scary, really.
It is. The instrumented mouth guards are interesting because I've got a little bit of experience of this. I've seen that not everyone wears them.
Yeah.
Like some people just choose not to wear them. I had a similar sort of story from a defense context where there was a similar technology that was attached to the person. Mm-hmm. They are then experiencing blasts, so in like a demolition sort of role. And the people who are being exposed to these blasts just take them off.
Yes.
They leave them in the kit bag. They don't wear them.
Yeah.
So, we can use these technologies, but if the individuals who are being exposed to these head injuries, if they're in a culture that doesn't value the fact that they are underperforming because of these head injuries, they are likely to get things wrong.
Yeah.
Do we need to start educating not just the coaches, the directing staff, the commanding officers? Is it the individuals? Are they the ones that need more education?
Without doubt. And I think that's, again, where I've moved to with the book. It's like, how am I going to try to affect positive change here? How am I going to keep driving cultural change, essentially? And it always comes back to that old saying, education, education, education. And unless you really clearly articulate the reasons for doing these things, then they're always going to fall flat. I think embedding technology into kits is incredibly important. And it's all well and good just mandating that players or whoever it may be use this. But ultimately, you're absolutely right. If guys don't understand and it's not sort of reinforced internally within the team, then it's not going to work. And I think a lot of this technology is still in its relative infancy, although it's clear in the last 10 years it's come forward a very, very long way. I think there's a temptation by governing bodies to just go, oh, we've got instrumented mouth guards now, so that's just player welfare sorted. So far from the truth. I think the reality is those mouth guards, as I said, to me, they're an exercise in building data, which will then be actioned in the future. But at the moment, the only real knowledge that we have of how do we reduce the long-term risks of developing things later on in life is to reduce exposure. Now, I fully appreciate that is nigh on impossible in battlefield environments or certain walks of life. But then I guess the piece after that becomes managing it better and understanding it better. And again, that comes down to education. And that's really where I've sort of set my path now for the next decade, or as long as anyone wants to listen to me.
Yeah, just on that really quickly, I think there's almost like an initiation, like how close can you get to the blast when you're doing DEMS training? It's almost like a badge of honor of how close can you actually get to it, and just some education around that to say, hang on a minute, this isn't a good idea. I think that's going to be really important.
I sort of reflect on some of the things I did in training when I played, and I fully respect that culture where you've got to laugh at things when they're shit. I get it. And when you're in it with your mates, it is brutal, and that's partly what rugby players sign up to. It's partly what military sign up to. And you will find yourself in extreme situations which are unusual, and most people outside of that environment won't understand it. But also, if you're in a high-performance environment, it's about being as smart as you can be, as much as being as macho and as tough as you can be. And, the best teams I've seen operating have that combination of lots of really smart people. You've got some smart people who are also quite macho and prepared to be brutal, and you've got some smart people who don't go in for the physicality side of things, but they're still absolutely integral members of that team. And I think what's being understood more and more through this is that looking after your brain is a really smart thing to do, and being reckless with your brain is probably not that smart. And I think the best teams in the future are going to be the ones that look after the brain health of their guys more than others.
Yeah, it's almost a ridiculous statement to make, isn't it? That we're at this point where we have to tell people that their brain is quite important and you should look after it.
Yeah.
It's a strange place to be.
It really is. It is. It's so obvious, isn't it? But I guess maybe that's where the word concussion is quite unhelpful. And actually we should be talking about brain trauma, because it cuts through a little bit. But yeah, as you say, it's so obvious, but then why is there so much bad practice and so much sort of stupidity around it? And that, again, I guess comes back to education.
It's interesting, Sam, because you look at obviously the mechanisms from a military standpoint. There's exposure to a lot of sub-concussive type events, it starts to make you think, well, if someone's exposed to that acutely, but then chronically over a long period of time. So if we think rugby, they may have a playing career of, let's say, 10 years.
Yeah.
But someone in the military, there may be 10, 20, 30 years of chronic exposure. Mm-hmm. If that was the case, what might be the long-term potential effects? So obviously you mentioned CTE.
Yeah.
What is CTE and what can it potentially lead to?
Before you answer that, Sam, I want JP to tell us what CTE stands for. This is where he tries to pronounce the words.
Chronic encephalopathy. I cannot pronounce it.
Sam, over to you. You tell us what it really stands for.
You nailed it. So chronic traumatic encephalopathy or chronic traumatic encephalopathy. But CTE is definitely easier. So if we stick with CTE, but essentially CTE is that punch-drunk syndrome, dementia pugilistica, which Harrison Martland identified 100 years ago in boxers, punch-drunk boxers. And CTE can manifest in all manner of ways, and indeed it can be pretty much asymptomatic. So you can live with it for a long time without knowing, but essentially CTE is punch-drunk syndrome or dementia pugilistica, or that's the pathology that it demonstrates. But it's a neurodegenerative disease that is now associated with repetitive head injuries. It can manifest in multiple ways. But I think what is now being shown in more and more research is that even things like motor neuron disease, Parkinson's disease, other neurodegenerative dementia-type illnesses are more and more being associated with repetitive head injuries and repetitive head traumas. And that's why I go back to really the only thing we know in terms of reducing your risk of developing that later in life is reducing exposure. But it's a complex disease. We don't know that much about it at the moment. It's fair to say in the last 10 years, the knowledge has increased significantly. When I first started writing about CTE and the concerns around it, the NHS didn't even have it on their website. Now it absolutely is recognised by the NHS. And indeed, the causal link between repetitive head injuries and CTE is recognised by some of the biggest health organisations in the United States. And it's inevitable that causality will be recognised in the UK as well. So, yeah, we're much further down the road to understanding, but that's not to say we understand it. And I say we, obviously I'm not a medically trained expert. I probably understand the issues more than most, but the neurologists and those who work in the world of brain health and brain medicine are more and more across what CTE actually is. Unfortunately, the NFL is a space where massive high risk of concussion, despite them wearing helmets. Some people say that's actually part of the reason that they suffer more concussions, but more and more brains of deceased NFL stars and other contact collision sports are being examined, and a very high proportion of them have traces of CTE to greater or lesser degrees. But CTE is present in, I think it's fair to say, the majority of those that have been examined, although there is a bias on that in that the people that tend to have donated their brains either have donated them whilst they were experiencing symptoms, or their families have donated their brains because they had serious concerns about the state of them, basically. Anyone who's watched the film Concussion, Will Smith's film, there's a guy called Mike Webster, who was an NFL Hall of Famer, who died in a pickup truck in a car park, basically homeless, and he killed himself, and his brain was looked at by Bennett and Marlowe post-mortem, and that's when CTE was found.
Am I right in thinking that CTE can only be diagnosed post-mortem, or is there a way of diagnosing it before someone has to donate their brain?
Yeah, I mean, that's always been the understanding, that CTE is diagnosable post-mortem. Certainly X-rays aren't going to pick it up, and the sort of micro damage that CTE presents with. Even MRI scans, certainly CT scans, are not going to pick this up. But as the science of scanning basically improves, the technology improves, it's able to identify more precisely what damage has been incurred, and it's getting to the point, or certainly progressing towards the point, where I think CTE could be diagnosable before someone dies. But I think the diagnosis at the moment would be probable CTE rather than a definitive diagnosis of CTE.
Sam, just to expand upon that, so am I correct in believing that CTE there's a build-up of tau proteins within the brain. Is that correct?
That's right, yeah.
Is there any work being done within the medical community looking at, can that protein be picked up as a biomarker? Is there an increase in said protein within the bloodstream, for example? Could that be used as a marker for someone developing CTE, or is it just a sort of a theory?
Yeah, and I'm sort of got to be careful not to wander further out of my lane of expertise than I should. But without doubt, there are research projects ongoing looking at biomarkers in saliva, blood tests. How quickly can we identify that trauma has occurred, essentially? And that's part of the technology that I've been alluding to, but also the dream in a way, if that's the right word. It might be a nightmare, who knows? But essentially, if we can test saliva to see if there are indicators within the saliva and actually get almost like a sort of litmus test on the side of the pitch, and then we can give a really definitive diagnosis. But yes, so that work is definitely going on, JP. I'd have to be cautious about how far I'll give my own sort of expert opinion on that, but there's a lot of work being done to detect those biomarkers and understand how that's manifesting.
No, interesting, very interesting. You mentioned in your book, and you also gave several examples of secondary impact syndrome. So could you give us more of an insight into what is secondary impact syndrome and some of the examples where it's sort of been apparent within rugby?
Yeah, well, one of the cases, the saddest case in many ways, although there's been many sad cases that I've covered and they are tough to read about, I accept, although hopefully the way I present it in the book is there's elements of hope within the stories and also elements of great bravery and great determination on behalf of individuals who've either lost loved ones or whose loved ones have suffered as a result of these head injuries. But Ben Robinson was a 14-year-old boy playing rugby in Northern Ireland, suffered multiple concussions on the pitch in the same game. Despite demonstrating some pretty clear indicators of concussion, he was allowed to play on. He died 2 days later. His father, Peter, was there when they turned off his life support machine. And he argues, Peter, to this day, that if one person had been educated around what to look for in a concussion, then my son would still be alive today. And you'd think a rugby player, 14-year-old boy, dies on a rugby field. You'd think everyone would know about that. I like to think a lot more people would know about it now if it happened, but actually around that time, 2011, 12, I didn't know about it as a rugby journalist working for a national newspaper. I hadn't heard about it until a coroner actually looked into it and diagnosed Ben as being the first person to have been diagnosed to have died with second impact syndrome. And that is essentially a swelling of the brain. Adolescent brains are much more susceptible to brain trauma, and that's why we have to be especially careful, I'd say, with kids, and why lots of the work now being done is to understand how we can minimise head trauma exposure in children. But it's essentially where the brain swells, second impact syndrome, after the first trauma, and then much more susceptible to a second trauma, second impact, and the risk increases significantly after that. But I identify a number of other cases of second impact syndrome in the book. And it incredibly, in a way, and shockingly, it was something that was proactively underplayed by some senior doctors within the world of sport. And again, I call them out in the book. I call out the research that I think was questionable. And I was suspicious quite early on of a couple of guys who I was reading their work and going, that to me as a layman, that doesn't appear to be particularly sophisticated work that you're doing. They were saying the same things 10 years afterwards that they were saying 10 years before. And for me, if you're working in the world of research, that should probably be a bit concerning. What were they actually learning, or did they already know everything? Second impact syndrome is described as one of the great myths of sport. And, you tell that to Ben Robinson, his father, Peter, or Ben's family. And yeah, it's a risk, and it's something that we need to understand and be educated about in order to minimise risk to kids.
Absolutely. It's a very, very sad story. So there's a few sad stories in the book. If we're talking about this second impact syndrome, does it get worse if the first impact is worse? Or is it just the fact that you are getting more and more head injuries? Or is it a case of someone has to be knocked out and then a smaller injury will create a big problem? So I'm trying to understand, how many injuries? Is it secondary? Is it tertiary? And do we need to be concerned by the slightest head injury? I know you say, if in doubt, sit them out.
Yeah.
That policy that you've talked about in the book.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of other occupations away from rugby. At what point do we need to look at someone who's training and say you are at risk of a secondary impact syndrome?
It's an incredibly difficult question to answer. And it's almost like...
I always throw at least one hand grenade out. There's always one. There's yours.
And so there you go. Thank you for that. And it's, what's interesting now from the work I'm doing is that I'm on the receiving end of those questions, whereas I was previously the one asking the questions. So I guess what goes around comes around. But ultimately, there are clear definitions around what a concussion looks like. If you are demonstrating those symptoms, we can see that you've had a head injury. Again, I guess part of this conversation, which we perhaps haven't had, is that a lot of the time head injuries occur and no one sees them. And that's been the case on sports fields. Again, going back to the initial conversation about rugby speeding up, what became really tricky was that often you'd have one guy, a medic, on the touchline with a bucket and a cold sponge, and you'd be having sometimes several head injury events happening on the pitch at the same time or close together. And actually just being able to see that someone had had that head injury, and that's part of the video work that's come into the game latterly. And we've talked a bit about the chaos of a battlefield, actually knowing that one of your guys has suffered a head impact. Sometimes you don't know, they don't know, because they might have lost consciousness for reasons we've discussed. They don't even recall it happening. So that's really difficult. But when you have seen a head impact, there are different mechanisms from which the brain can be rattled around, left to right, front to back, from the top, underneath, blast pressure, different ways that the brain can suffer trauma. If you believe that that's happened and then you're seeing symptoms manifest reasonably soon afterwards, you should be concerned about second impact syndrome. I guess that's one of the reasons those definitions were brought in. And so we could essentially define what we were looking for at a sporting level, but that's not to say it's a perfect catch-all way of looking after and getting the best out of your guys. So yeah, I don't know if that's answered what was a difficult question, but
it's very good.
It's a hard space to be in. And the one thing I've always said is that I have a significant degree of sympathy for medics and doctors on the spot, specifically, I guess, from the work I've done in a professional sports setting where there are all sorts of factors at play which make it very, very difficult to make that call. But having said that, the thing that I started calling out when we launched the concussion campaign in 2013, when I was at the Mail on Sunday, was the really obvious cases which were being very badly handled and where there was very little room for doubt as to whether a concussion had occurred. And I felt, and I still believe, that a lot of the time the guys were getting sent back on the field, not because anyone seriously thought that they were okay, but for reasons that were part commercially driven, but culturally driven, and just through a culture that had been created, which was essentially promoting really bad practice.
Sam, as a result of that work, did you find that within the sport that you were ostracised somewhat? Maybe not so by the players, but I can imagine the coaching staff or commercial entities with financial interest, this is not what they want to hear. So what sort of happened there?
Yeah, I mean, funnily enough, some of the players weren't that happy with what I was doing either, because if you think about it, and this was part of the reason we highlighted earlier on why this was basically allowed to happen, was that the players wanted to play. They want to play. They don't want to come off the field, especially if they kind of feel okay. And in that moment, a lot of them will basically go, I'm all right, I can carry on. And they would not just say to the doctor, please, can I carry on? They go, I am carrying on. Get off. Don't risk my future right now. I don't want to lose my place in the team. I don't want to show that I'm weak. There's a lot of factors at play there. I certainly pissed a lot of people off. I'd made peace quite early on with the fact it wasn't a popularity contest, and that's fine. I've got reasonably broad shoulders, and that's okay. A lot of the people I butted up against, let's say, were directors of rugby, who are often all-powerful in the professional sphere. They're kingmakers. They can play God. They can ostracise a player. They can sack a player. They can give them a 3-year contract. They can pick them. They can promote them. They are so powerful, too powerful in a lot of cases. And I highlight in the book a number of incidents, Bloodgate being one of them, but multiple cases where I either clashed with directors of rugby or fell out with them in another way. But essentially, the ones that I did fall out with quite spectacularly in a couple of cases, I can absolutely live with that. And I will challenge that kind of practice till the day I die, because I don't think it's the way you should treat people. It's bullying, basically, and it's cruel, and it's sometimes sadistic. I recognise the need to stress people in training. I totally get that. But I think that can so easily flip over into toxic culture where bullying pervades. And we saw that with Eddie Jones, the England coach. Danny Care recently in the Times, former England scrum half, highlighted a lot of incidents, some of which I knew about, some of which I've written about and highlighted, but essentially an acceptance from the players that this is how it was. And I think there's some serious questions still to be answered by the Rugby Football Union as to why they employed this bloke for 7 years. I do not believe that senior people within the Rugby Football Union didn't know what sort of practices were going on within the England environment. They were too weak to stand up to this guy and say, this is not what we stand for as an organisation. These are not the values that we want to promote within the sport. And this is not how we want to get the best out of our guys. And I think there was some incredibly weak leadership on display that allowed Eddie Jones to essentially rule the roost for 7 years of English rugby to the short, medium and longer term detriment of the sport in this country, I'd argue.
Quite right too. Now, JP and I don't work in rugby. We work with people in other high reliability roles, high stress roles, things like defence, security, policing, where there is a risk of head injuries just because of the nature of the jobs that these people are being asked to do. Mm-hmm. Now, you've spent a lot of time working in rugby, and I'm sure you've observed a lot of good and bad things. Mm-hmm. Can we sort of wrap up for today and maybe think about what can the world learn from rugby? So if we are looking at other occupations that potentially have a head injury problem or they're at risk of these MTBIs, is there anything that we can learn from your story, from your knowledge in rugby?
Well, I hope so. And I think the end of the book, I really hope presents a more hopeful, optimistic future. Like, I've spent a long time trying to convince people there was a problem. And I think that argument in many ways has been won. And I feel quite energised. I feel quite sad that it took so long to convince people that this was something we needed to take much more seriously, but let's look forward. I think what we can learn from rugby, the professional game, is how not to do things in the first place. When we look back 10, 15, 20 years ago, what was going on, that's how not to do it. I think now rugby has actually got itself into a better position. It's definitely ahead of other sports, I'd say, in terms of acknowledging that this is an issue we need to take really seriously and how it's better managed on the pitch. I think there's still some really, really disappointing incidents in Saturday's game, the England-Australia game, where the referee just looked at Tom Curry on the floor, who was unconscious, and the game just played on. And it was only when another player flagged it that the game was stopped. But in many ways, that's also a good thing because you've now got players self-policing, players looking after each other on the pitch, recognising we need to deal with this and treat it really, really seriously. I think longer-term baseline testing, I think, is incredibly important. We haven't looked at that yet, but there's, again, more and more sophisticated multimodal assessments of people's baseline performance when they haven't suffered a brain trauma and they're in a calm, secure, safe, chilled environment. You can measure a baseline and you can measure what their normal performance is, and then you can reference back to that when you suspect that they have had a brain trauma. And there's now some really, really excellent data around brain performance, basically measured against baseline, where you can actually say, that's a red flag, we need to look at that. And I think as that technology evolves and develops and education keeps being rolled out, then that's really good. I think the NFL has done some really great stuff. I don't think anybody would look at the NFL now and go, that game's gone a bit soft, hasn't it? That's not a tough sport to play. Actually, what a lot of people don't know is that actually once that legal case happened in 2013, $1 billion payout, so big money, that kicked in a load of changes behind the scenes. And one of the most important ones and one of the simplest ones, and this comes back to the point you made earlier on about initiation and stupid practice. So one of the most stupid practices I still think that goes on but is normal is highly physical contact training. I've mentioned the Eddie Jones thing, guys getting their careers ended during training. What on earth is that all about? More concussions suffered in professional rugby today during training than there's ever been. That's in the RFU's data. Why? These guys should be being looked after. They don't need to get their heads kicked in during the week in order to perform at the absolute top of their game on a Saturday. So much smarter training methods, recognising that we can actually get guys to optimise their performance, but without smashing the heck out of them before they take to that high pressure, high stress environment where they need to be and they're expected to be on top of their games.
That's a great way to wrap up, Sam. What's next for you? Where are you going next?
Well, thank you, Martin and Jonpaul. It's been my absolute pleasure being on this. Thanks for having me. But next is I created this business called Concussed Media. I want to stay in this conversation. I think I've got a decent amount to say on it, probably too much, some people would say, but I've spent a long time looking at this now, and I've sort of built up a bank of knowledge and contacts and experience and understanding. I want to share that with people. And I've set up this events business. Go onto our website, concussed.media, or just email me directly, sam@concussed.media. The paperback version of the book's coming out. I've been spending the last few months working with a scriptwriter called Nick Boothott. I'm absolutely committed to bringing the story of Concussed to the screen. So that's going to be going out to some production companies soon. So if there's anyone listening to this who could see this turning into a film, please do get in touch. But yeah, education's really my key piece now. Working with like-minded organisations who want to treat their people really well and who love sport and physical activity, as I absolutely do, by the way. I don't want anyone to stop playing rugby or sport and living really fulfilling outdoor lifestyles, but just do it in a smart way. Make sure you're educated and look after the people you're with.
Yeah, I again wholeheartedly agree. I like that. We wrap up the podcast every time by offering you the opportunity to give us the final words. This can be just reiterating a really important thing that you've already talked about. Maybe it's an opportunity to tell us something that you've missed or that you feel is important. But it's really just up to you to finish up for us. So over to you, Sam. How would you like to wrap the episode up?
Well, I'd just say play smart and play safe. In order to get the best performance out of yourselves and your team, make sure you're in the best nick you can be when you go into that environment. I think the smartest coaches now and the smartest players are the ones that are understanding that there's often hidden effects of brain trauma, and making sure you guys have got the most optimal brain health is going to mean that you win more situations than you lose.
Fantastic. Thanks again, Sam. Really enjoyed that.
Brilliant. Thanks, mate.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me, guys. Great to see you.
That's it for this week's episode of the Optimizing Human Performance podcast. Thanks for tuning in, and if you found this valuable, take a moment to rate and review the podcast. If you know someone who'd benefit from today's conversation, then please share this with them. We're always keen to hear your thoughts. If you have feedback, guest suggestions, or topics that you'd love us to cover, then email us at info@ophp.co.uk or connect with us on LinkedIn. Until next time, keep striving, keep improving, and keep optimizing your performance.